How's it going, everyone? Well, we have finally gotten to the part where I get to talk about H.P. Lovecraft's probably most famous, well-known work, The Call of Cthulhu. So I really don't think that there's any other work by his that has been more influential than The Call of Cthulhu. I mean, you have several spin-offs, video games, board games, even South Park did a bit about Cthulhu. So, if you don't know the story in detail, please, I highly recommend going and reading it, listening to it on Audible, and then coming back here. So, let's get started. The story starts when the narrator's uncle ends up passing away. Now, the narrator's uncle was a professor at a university in New England. Now, the narrator's uncle didn't have any kids or anything like that left, so everything went to the narrator. And when he goes and starts going through his uncle's affairs, he finds a box. And inside of the box is a clay statue of Cthulhu, sitting on a pedestal with all these different hieroglyphs and several manuscripts that the nephew starts reading through. Well, it turns out that the statue was made by a young artist who was having dreams of a very dark, creepy city called Relais, where Cthulhu resides. Now, all of this stuff was going on during a specific time period. And eventually, the artist and several other people were having these dreams and ended up going into a coma. And then all of a sudden, one day, all of that stuff stops and nobody really remembers what happened. So the nephew decides to do a little investigation of his own. Well, it turns out that the narrator's uncle, years before, had been at a conference with other very well-known professors of archaeology and different ancient dead languages and stuff like that. And there's a police chief from New Orleans who comes up to show them a little statuette that him and his men had found when they raided a cult meeting. And this little statuette is a slightly larger variant of the clay statuette that was found in that box. So it's a statuette of Cthulhu made out of a greenish black stone with little gold striations and stuff like that in it. And nobody can place it. Nobody has really a clue where the stone came from, what the hieroglyphs are, except for one professor who said that during an expedition to Greenland, they had come on some Inuits who worshipped Cthulhu. And so that's where he recognized the statuette and the hieroglyphs, because the Inuits up there had something similar. Well, the story goes on when the police chief recounts of how he came about acquiring this little statuette. And in New Orleans, there had been a bunch of people in the back swamps who had gone missing, and the people living there went to the police about it. And when the police investigated, they ended up coming upon a cult meeting where where the cult was dancing around this altar inside of a ring of fire, and around the altar were the mutilated, sacrificed remains of the missing people. Well, a firefight ensues. Some of the officers die, some of the cult members die, some of the cult members end up fleeing off into the woods, and a large number of the cult members get captured and subsequently interrogated. Well, it turns out that this cult, the Cult of Cthulhu, exists everywhere. They exist all over the place. And the cult has been around for thousands and thousands of years. A little later on in the story, the narrator ends up at a friend's shop where he sees a newspaper clipping from Australia about two men who were found on a ship. One of the men had died, and the other one was still alive, barely alive, and kind of stark raving mad, really. Well, eventually, the narrator... Sorry, let me back up a little bit. The sailor who survived was a Norwegian who had been living in New Zealand, and after he gets rescued, him and his wife move back to Norway to their old home in Oslo. So the narrator ends up going to Oslo to try and find the man, and he goes to the man's house, and it turns out that the sailor had just previously passed away very recently, and the wife allowed the narrator in, and the narrator was going through some of the sailor's effects when he comes upon a diary and some manuscripts that the sailor had written explaining what happened. Well, at the same time that all this stuff with the artist and all these other people were having all these crazy dreams and such, the sailor and his crew had left from New Zealand going to Palau, and they come across another ship somewhere in the South Pacific. Well, this ship opened fire on the sailors. They ended up hitting the sailor's ship beneath the waterline, so their ship is sinking, so they have no choice but to board the ship and fight off the attackers. Well, they end up killing all of the attackers. Some of the sailors die, and inside of the ship they find another little statuette of Cthulhu. So the ship that the sailors had taken over was being crewed by members of the Cult of Cthulhu. Well, this sailor, he was the highest ranking officer that actually survived the fight, so him and the other sailors decide to continue going on the same course that the ship that they had captured was going to. And eventually they come upon an island that has a massive city on it with monoliths and such, and this is the city of Relea. Now they go ashore, they poke around a little bit, and they find this big door that has a carving of Cthulhu on it. Well, one of the hapless sailors ends up accidentally opening the door, and deep down inside, Cthulhu awakens. He comes up out of his tomb, and some of the sailors get killed by Cthulhu at this point. The rest of them go fleeing back to the ship, and Cthulhu is pursuing them. Well, there's only two sailors the Norwegian and the other man who later dies, who actually make it back to the ship. And since it's just two of them, they're having a bit of a difficult time getting the ship up and running and getting the ship underway. All the while, Cthulhu is pursuing them. Well, the Norwegian man ends up deciding that he needs to turn the ship around and head straight for Cthulhu. Well, he rams the ship into Cthulhu's head, splits Cthulhu's head apart, and gets past him, and when he looks back, he can see Cthulhu's head recombining and everything. And they end up escaping, and somehow Cthulhu ends up going back into his tomb and going back to sleep. And so the city of R'lyeh ends up collapsing and going back underneath the ocean. Because later on, when the Royal Navy investigates and they go back to the spot where R'lyeh was, there was nothing but ocean. And it was at this same time that all of the dreams and stuff end up stopping, and everybody wakes up from their comas and doesn't have any clue what happened. So towards the end of the story, the narrator feels that the cult of Cthulhu murdered his uncle and the Norwegian sailor, and he's fearing for his own life as well because he knows too much. So that's the overview, very simplistic summary of the Call of Cthulhu. This one's probably my favorite story so far out of everything that Lovecraft had worked on and written. It's probably the most famous one that plenty of people know about. And yeah, I mean, I just really, really enjoyed the story. I loved how everything kind of unfolds, and just the mysterious ancient horror that is Lovecraftian cosmic horror. So hope you guys enjoyed that. A little bit later on today, I am going to end up a little bit later on today, I'm going to record another video talking about the curious case of Charles Dexter Ward. That one's going to be another longer video than this one. Well, yeah, it's going to be another longer video because it's another one of the longer stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote. So, hope you guys enjoy it, and have a great day.